In the past weeks, I've continued work on the Olive Street module, and here's a rundown of what happened. One major step was putting all the utility poles in place. While I was working on that, the new styrene sheets arrived so I could finish constructing the large building next to the siding. The next step was painting all the parts, which took a bit of experimenting with the colors. Eventually I settled on a mix of mostly Tamiya XF2 flat white with a little bit of XF19 sky gray for the roof and a mix of flat white and XF57 buff for the walls. The base received a plain coat of sky gray. Before painting the walls, I painted the gutter between the building parts XF16 flat aluminium, even though this turned out to be hardly visible after assembly. While assembling, I also noticed that the gutter was not wide enough to allow for the roofs to fit properly, which resulted in the entire building tacoing a little. I added another screw to fasten the structure to the base. The next step was adding a little bit of weathering with pan pastels, just enough to break up the uniform paint job. The base of the structure received a more elaborate weathering. First I dry brushed acrylic white and light gray in a vertical pattern, and then a layer of vertical streaks with black oil paint, followed by a layer of streaks with raw umbra oil paint. The effect was nice but a little bit too strong, so I used neutral gray pan pastels to make the base more uniform again. Adding the downspout between the two sections of the building gave the front immediately more structure, a nice effect for such a little detail. I also added a power meter to the green building and outside illumination to both of the structures. The lights are 3D printed parts glued to O204 LEDs, which are painted to block the light. I'm not quite sure how I'm going to control these lights. I'm leaning towards an Arduino Micro, so I have the option to have some flexibility. While the structures were off the module, I used the opportunity to also touch up the paint on the module sidewalls. When working with static grass, there are always some fibers that remain stuck to the sidewalls of the static grass applicator. I collect those in a small plastic bag and used them to make a couple of grass tufts on a piece of aluminium foil and randomly placed them on the module. I also applied static grass in various places directly and placed a bush from Wellberg scenery next to the large building to have a little bit of taller vegetation. The next major thing to do was the assembly of the chain link fence. I wanted to avoid having too many of the supports too close to each other, so I assembled several segments together. One thing that turned out to be really important is the alignment of the various segments. The fence is very flexible horizontally, but not at all vertically. So a slightly misaligned solder joint can easily result in parts of the fence not properly contacting the ground in some areas. I had to resolder a couple of joints to achieve an acceptable result. I'll have to think about how this might affect the long stretches of fence I've planned for the glacier module. I cleaned up the fence with alcohol before painting to get rid of any residues from the soldering. I planned to paint it a very light gray, but the light gray primer turned out to be very close to what I had in mind, so I didn't bother with the actual paint and just stuck it onto the module as it was. A big part of that decision was that I noticed the material ripping at the corners, so I really had to stop messing with the fence. My original idea with the steel wire was to just have it as additional reinforcement to keep the fence upright if I accidentally bump into it, but I think I'll also have to solder steel wires into the corners as reinforcement as well. So I glued the fence in place with the Noch static grass glue. I applied little drops of it to the feet of the fence where there were no steel wires and no holes in the scenery base, and that seems to keep it in place rather nicely. After the glue had dried, I bent the barbed wire portion on top of the fence to the outside and then applied a bit of neutral gray and neutral gray extra dark pan pastels with a brush for some subtle weathering and in an attempt to tone down the slight sheen of the primer. Then I applied burnt sienna extra dark pastel powder with a damp brush to the barbed wire, since that tends to rust rather quickly. Finally, I applied a bit of the burnt sienna randomly to other parts of the fence to break up the uniform appearance. With the last major part out of the way, I started painting two concrete barriers meant to keep drivers from going onto the spur track. I used Tamiya light gray primer from a rattle can and then brush painted the barriers with 2 layers of sky gray. Then I weathered them with burnt sienna extra dark pastels on the rail side, followed with neutral gray extra dark pastels on both sides to tie everything together. That's all I've got for now. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments.